To save everyone time, what I've gone ahead for part 2 is actually set up a basic application for you in either, you can access this via Snack, I'll have links for both of these in the description, but you can access the entire starting application on Snack, or you can just go ahead and download it off GitHub. I'll have a link down below. But what this application actually includes is a very simple app. So we've got our sign up page, we've got our sign in page, we've got some basic authentication or just kind of verification here to make sure you're actually passing values. Once you log in with seemingly correct values, you can then see a profile screen, log out. Everything works as you would expect it to. I'm using React Navigation here for our basic navigation. We've got two different stacks depending on if the user's signed in or not. We've got our login screen, which is just very simple. It's got some text inputs. You can update the values there. It'll then check if you actually passed an email and a password. Registers the same thing. It's just checking if the passwords are actually the same. And then we've got this little util library, which is just a bit of a wrapper around async storage. You can take a moment to actually pause and look over it, but it's very, very simple in how we're using it. So again, either download the project or you can use it on Snack just so you can do everything in the browser, whatever your choice is, but I can't really record my screen and use a simulator with Snack, so I'll be doing everything locally. So the first thing that we need to do to actually get the React Native client and the backend talking is make our connection to our GraphQL endpoint. And if you're using Launchpad from part 1, you can actually go ahead and grab that endpoint right down here at the bottom of the screen, copy that, and then if we go over to our editor, I'm going to go to my app.js. This is the same on Snack or in this case. And what we want to do, I'll just put this in a comment here so that we have it. But first thing we want to do is actually import a few packages or a few functions for us. And to make it easy for you to follow along, I've just already saved everything to the package.json, so if you downloaded it, it'll automatically install those. But what we want to do is import Apollo client, HTTP link, and in-memory cache from Apollo client-preset. Alright, and that's something nice to know about. Apollo client preset is going to give you a few things so you don't have to install more packages. With those, what we want to do is actually create a new client which we can then use with Apollo provider. So what we'll do is say const client is equal to a new Apollo client, and inside of Apollo client we can pass a configuration object. First thing we've got is link, which is going to be a new HTTP link, and inside of there we want to pass the URI. That URI is going to be our GraphQL endpoint, so I can pass that in here. The other thing we want to do is set up our cache, so we'll say cache is going to be a new in-memory cache. Alright, now we need to actually share this client with our application, and if we go back to the top, we're going to import another package, and this is going to be called Apollo provider, and that's going to come from React Apollo, and that's going to basically add a client to the React context so we can access it anywhere in our application. And what I want to do here is we're going to add a new return up here for right now, and I'm going to say Apollo provider. Alright, and that's going to take one prop, and that prop's client, which is where we pass the client we just set up. And then inside of there we can actually pass the children or whatever should actually be rendered with the necessary data. So I'll just copy what we had previously. And then inside of some curly braces, I'll just go ahead and actually pass that information. So now Apollo provider, the client is going to be passed to all of the components, children of this Apollo provider component. Okay, and now we can go ahead and actually try to register users. So going to my register.js file, first thing we want to do is import the necessary packages. That's going to be GraphQL, which is import GraphQL from React Apollo. And then we're going to import GQL from GraphQL-tag. And basically the process that the user is going to be going through when they register is they'll attempt to log in, which we'll use attempt to create a account, and we'll be using that signup mutation for that. And then if they're successful, we're going to save the JWT that's returned to async storage via our little util library we set up. And then if they do successfully log in, we're going to switch their view from this register screen to the profile screen that we saw previously. So we can get started by actually scrolling all the way down to where we've got our export default register, which is the component we're exporting. And what we want to do is actually wrap that with this GraphQL and with our GQL, or our actual query. So I'm going to say export default GraphQL, okay, and then so we've got one function call, and then we've got the register as the second one. And inside of this first one, we'll just create a new line. I'm going to say GQL, and then we'll use the backticks here, which is where we can actually write our mutation. And if I go back to Launchpad, we can actually go ahead and just copy this mutation we set up previously. So it's just like what we used in GQL, or in Launchpad. We've got our sign up mutation, we're passing the email, we're passing the password, and we're requesting certain pieces of data back. Now obviously we can't just pass these static pieces of data in, so what we want to do is actually start using variables inside of our mutation so that we can actually pass whatever the user's passing to it. So up where we're defining mutation, we can just name it, and we'll name it sign up, and then inside of here we'll pass whatever variables will actually be passed in. So we've got the email, which is going to be a required string, and then we've also got password, which is also going to be a required string. Then inside of here where we've actually got our mutation, instead of hard coding a string in there, we can then pass the variables, which is $email, and then we can also do $password. Then what we want to do is actually make this signup mutation available via props. I like to do this that way the client or the component's always calling this.props.signup versus something more specific to the Apollo implementation. So what we'll do here is after this backtick, we can then pass a new object in here, and we'll pass props, which is going to take a function. We can use object destructuring here to access the mutate property, and then from here we're going to return an object from this props function, and on here we're going to add signup, right? And that's going to take an email and a password, just like what we're expecting up here in our mutation. And then we can then call this mutate function that we're accessing via arguments, and we can then specify the variables we want to pass to it, which corresponds with our email and our password. So that'll just be an object, which will be email and password. Okay, now let's actually go ahead and call this. So if we scroll up to our handle submit function, basically once we get through all of this, once the emails, valid, passwords, email, all of that, what we want to do is instead of return this.props.screenProps.changeLogin_state, which is actually just going to change screens, we actually want to call the correct mutation. So what I'm going to say is this.props, and then on a new line I'm going to say .signup, which is what we're adding from Apollo. We're going to pass the email and password, which we specified there. And then once that returns, we can say .then. We'll pass in a function here, and inside of this function we can again use object destructuring. Basically what's happening is Apollo is going to give this response a data property, and inside of there we can use that information to then say basically pull the data off of the signup. So it's going to have the form of data.signup. And basically this then is only going to be called if it was successfully returned, otherwise we're going to have some sort of error. So what I can say here is just return this.props.screenProps.change login state, and when this is called we're going to have a successful response, so we want to call true, and then we also want to pass the JWT up to that component so we can actually save it. So I'll say data.signup.jwt, and the last thing we want to do is actually catch any errors. Okay, so what I'm doing here is basically if the error message has email in it, I'm going to just set state and say there's some error with the email. Otherwise, if password somewhere in the error message, then I'm going to assume there was some sort of error with the password, and we'll just show that. This is a super simple implementation. You can do a lot more. You should do a lot more in a real application to really tell the user what's going on, but just in the interest of brevity, that's all we're doing here. Okay, now before we actually go ahead and test this out, let's go ahead and update this change login state, and this is actually coming to us from our app.js. So I'll go back to that file, and you can see on the screen props for our React navigation, we're passing handle change login state. And currently all it's accepting is this logged in argument, which we're using to actually specify which stack should be shown, but we also want to accept the JWT so we can actually go ahead and save that. And there's two functions we need to import. Those are coming from our util library, so we'll import sign in and sign out from ./util. So basically going back down to our handle change login state, if we're logged in, then we want to actually go ahead, call sign in and pass that JWT which was passed to it. And this will then go ahead and allow us to save it to async storage. Else, we'll then call sign out, which will just clear that JWT from async storage and we don't have to worry about it anymore. Let's go ahead and give this a quick shot, see what happens. Press sign up. And you can see we're actually getting an error here because I'm trying to register with an email that's already been used. So instead of spencer@handlebarlabs.com, I'm just going to go ahead and use C, which I don't believe I've used. So if I press sign up now, you can see we go to the profile screen, which means we got to this point in time, so everything is working out well for us now. Now one thing you should note is if I actually go ahead and refresh this application, we're going back to the register screen even though our JWT has been saved to async storage. To alleviate this issue is pretty straightforward, and I should note what I'm about to do is an extremely trivial implementation that could result in some issues in your application. Basically, what we're going to do is check if the client has a JWT inside of async storage. If they do, we're going to automatically assume it's valid and show them the profile screen. You'll probably want to actually check the validity of that JWT before you actually go and show the profile screen, or you'll want to check the validity of it when you show the profile screen, just to make sure this user that says they're a user is actually using a valid token. But for our simple implementation, all we're going to do is import a new function from our util library called GetToken. And then if we scroll down inside of our component, we're going to add a component will mount, and I'm going to add that await keyword beforehand. And I'll say component will mount. And inside of there, what we're going to do is say const token is equal to await get token, which is just going to return a promise. And if the token does exist, so if something is in async storage, then we'll say this dot set state is equal to logged in true. And you can see I shouldn't have put await here, it should be async. So async component will mount. We'll wait. When I reload this, what should happen is we'll go instantly to the profile screen versus the register screen because we already had that logged in, or we already had that token in async storage. So we've got our user registered here, we've got their JWT saved, but if we keep refreshing this, we're just going to keep seeing the profile screen, and we want to actually enable logout for us. So what we want to do is going to the actual profile screen, which is where our logout is. You can see we're already calling change login state to false. And if we go to app.js, you'll see that within our handle change login state. If logged in is false, we're going to call sign out. And looking at that function, what's going to happen is we're going to remove that item from async storage. So basically, sign out's already been set up for us automatically with the way this is all set up. So all you need to do, press log out. It's going to bring us to our register screen. If I try to refresh it, we are logged out and we no longer go to the profile until we register or log in. Alright, with those things completed, next thing we want to do is actually set up our login. And login is going to be almost exactly the same as register. So I'm just going to type through this and then we can walk through the code once it's all put together, rather than kind of having to make you just watch me type stuff out. Now let's go ahead and use this new mutation or this new prop that's available. So scrolling up to our handle submit, what we'll do is say this dot props, then we'll say dot login, so that prop that's made available to us. We'll pass the email and password, which at this point we assume is as close to valid as we can make sure it is on the client. Then once we got a response back from there, we can destructure this so we can access the data on it. Make sure you use the proper number of parentheses here. This is going to be a function, and then inside of here we're then going to use this return this dot props dot screen props dot change login state. We're going to pass true, and we're also going to pass the data.login.jwt. So that aligns with login JWT, and it's going to be available on data. And then finally, which I just pasted in here, we're going to handle our errors in the exact same way that we did for register. Okay, let's go ahead and give this a shot. I save this, go to our sign-in page. I'll say Spencer at handlebarlabs.com, and then we can say password, which is the password I set up, press sign in, and after a moment we are shown the profile screen. And then if I go ahead and go back to sign in and I say no at no.com, and then we try to pass a password, we'll see that we do get an error back. So we are communicating correctly with the back end of our application because no user exists with that email address. So let's go ahead and actually sign in here. Spencer at handlebarlabs.com. We'll use a password, sign in, and now what we want to do is on this profile screen, we want to actually show some data about the user. We want to show their ID and their email specifically. So again, we'll be using our GraphQL query, so I'm going to import GraphQL, I'm going to import GQL, and then again, I'll just walk through this once I've got it typed out. Okay, so what I'm doing here is, again, we're just accessing that GraphQL, the query endpoint of current user that we set up in the part 1. We just want to get the ID and the email back as our response. So now we can actually go ahead and use that data in our component. So what I'm going to do inside of my render method is I'll say const current user is going to be equal to this.props.data. And then inside of content, we'll say if the current user is available, then we'll go ahead and start rendering out some of that data, and we'll do that via the text component. So current user dot underscore ID, and then we'll also do their email address. So current user dot email. All right, save this. We'll wait a second, and while you see nothing showing up, even though our query is set up, we're not seeing any sort of errors popping up. What's going on here? Well, the issue here is that we're not passing the JWT via the authorization header at any point in time to our backend. So the backend, the GraphQL endpoint, doesn't know how to add the user to context, which we're relying on to get responses back from current user. So that's what we're going to need to do now, is actually add the JWT to the authorization headers with any requests we're making to our endpoint. And to do that, we'll go back to our app.js, and at the top of the file, we're going to import set context from Apollo link context. Then we're going to scroll down here before we actually define the client, and we're going to set up a new link, and we're going to call this the auth link. Okay, and inside of here, we're going to use this set context that we're getting from Apollo link context. And inside of here, we can access everything about the request. So we'll get a new function. We're going to use async here, so we can use async and await. And the first variable is going to be the request. The second one's going to be a bunch of different data, an object of data. So we can actually use object destructuring here again, and we'll be accessing the headers. And then inside of this function that we're actually setting up, we can say, first off, we'll try to get the token. So token is equal to await GetToken. And then from here, we're going to return all of our headers that already exist, and then we're going to add the new header, and inside of here we'll set authorization. And basically, if the token exists, then we're going to add it. So we'll say bearer space token. Otherwise, if the token doesn't exist, then we can just pass null as the authorization header. To actually use this, we'll go ahead and define a new link. First, I'll go ahead and pull this HTTP link out, and we'll just set this to, we'll put this above the auth link, and we'll just say const HTTP link is equal to what we previously had set up. And then right before we actually use this link, I'll create a new variable, and we'll just call this link, and we can say link is equal to authlink dot concat the HTTP link. That way we're using both of those for every request we make. So if I save this, it'll refresh. We'll need to give it a second, and we can see we're getting an error, can't find variable view, logout. So if I go to profile, which is where we've got that logout component, I'm going to assume I have not imported view into it, and that is correct. So import view from React Native. We'll save this and actually see if we get response in the data we expect. And you can see after a moment, we are getting the ID, we are getting the the user's email back as well. All right, and with that, our basic introduction to GraphQL authentication using MongoDB and React Native is pretty much all wrapped up. A few things if you want to go a bit further on this, a few additional exercises, is first you could try checking the validity of a JWT before choosing which layout the user sees. So you'd need to add an endpoint to your backend and then call that backend from your client and then decide what you should actually show at that point. Another good feature to add to this application would be some loading indicators. There's going to be network delays. You should tell the user what's going on, that the app has actually heard them, it's doing something. Add some sort of loading indicator. And then finally, another good addition to this app would be just better error handling, and that could be a good way to experiment with all the different errors that you could potentially see when you're working with Apollo and GraphQL. If you found this series helpful, be sure to subscribe to this channel. I do a lot of React Native training. I plan to continue to update and add more videos to this channel, so make sure to subscribe. If you found it helpful, send it to someone else. Maybe it's a coworker you're also working with on this. And then also, if you're interested in being sent more React Native content, maybe it's videos, maybe it's tutorials, maybe it's courses, I've got an email list. I'll have a link down below for that. And the last thing is the completed code. Link to that will be available down in the description below. So thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful.